Hyperdimensional. Best event in my life. Prologue. I have always been reluctant to write down and submit an experience like this, due to two reasons. Firstly, I don't feel very comfortable expressing something which is so personal and subjective. And secondly, because in a trip like this, the perception is so disorganized, or more precisely, so differently organized from the usual one, that trying to write down the sensations, feelings, and thoughts that take place during the experience is quite inaccurate and imprecise. However, I have had recently 2 trips that had been considerably more important than the rest, and they are so stunning that I think it would be nice to write down something about them. Both trips are independent and can be read separately. The reason for submitting them together is that they show in some way 2 very different facets of the psychedelic experience. The first trip is the most powerful experience of my life, and quite a dysphoric one, while the second one is the best and most beautiful experience of my life. So, after this introduction, let's move to the matter of this experience report, the second trip. Personal background. I am an experienced psychedelic user, even doing psychedelics almost daily, or very regularly in some periods. Previous to this trip, I have had lots of experiences, especially quite a lot of DMT ones, including strong breakthroughs. I had also experimented with trips and substances in different contexts and settings. On the other side, it is important to know that my main interest in life is geometry, also other parts of maths, in the sense of the understanding and visualization of beautiful, complicated, stunning, and new geometrical phenomena related to intersections, hypersurfaces, higher dimensions, etc. In fact, I am a string/M theory and algebraic geometry researcher. This intellectual/professional passion is also my main interest about the psychedelic experience, and without it, you cannot understand why this concrete trip was so significant and beautiful to me. In this sense, I think my interest in DMT is quite understandable, taking into account its visual and geometrical richness. For example, quoting Psychonaut Wiki, the geometry present in the smokable DMT is considered by many to be the most profoundly intricate and complex set of visual geometry found within the entirety of the psychedelic experience. Setting. I live alone in my house. On this occasion, I was sitting at my desk with my laptop and several monitors showing different images, papers, and videos about nice, colorful, intricate geometric visualizations, including representations of higher dimensional ones. The lights of the room were completely on. I wanted a bright, clear-colored scenario. And although it was quite hot, I was wearing a lab coat. I know, it's kind of freaky, but I like high temperature. And above all, the coat gives a futuristic taste for my imagination to run wild. In the time before, I had been thinking and meditating about some geometry stuff. As an aside, I don't like to give advices or something, because every brain is different. However, I think people tend to underestimate the influence of the content of their own minds in the time previous to the trip. Not only the setting, but the questions you have. I think that having some nice, true questions in mind can contribute to make the trip more interesting, and also can make the brain not to recreate itself in a bad feeling or thought, which otherwise it can originate a bad trip. At the beginning, my mood was not very relaxed, but neither too nervous. Dosage and pre-trip. Previous to the main trip, once I had already prepared everything, I did a first trip. My intention was doing several. That one was also quite interesting on its own, but it turned to be just a prologue of what was going to happen. So, I'm not going to detail it here. I smoked slightly more than 40 milligrams in my GVG, quite properly during a nice time. It was considerably powerful, and I broke through. I am unsure if I took several hits or only one. What I certainly remember is that by the time I started to feel more or less normal, I was still a bit high, but not very much, I took my other GVG with around 45 milligrams of DMT. And then the main trip began. The main thing. The main thing is what I was transported into a hyperdimensional 6D world, and my mind was amazed in happiness and saturated, in a good way, in geometrical blooming and celebration. To arrive to that crazy state, the process was quite strange and very hard to put into words, but I'll try to do my best. At the beginning, I started to feel heavy, especially my chest and shoulders, and I started to sink in my chair by sliding with my right shoulder, following a circular path. At the same time, the vision started to appear, and a new scene was overcoming the physical, real world. A circle line appeared, and then the yellow, orange, golden figure scene started to emerge from the right. At the same time, I was following circular paths, which started with the circle line inside the figure scene. Then the figure scene became ampler and ampler gradually, and got a more complicated shape, although it retained some spherical symmetry. During the process, the sense of touch played an interesting role. The real displacement occurred when I moved in a touch way, imagining I was moving my shoulder/chest. As this was happening, I felt a bit uncomfortable because I felt somewhat trapped. I felt a modified gravity attracting me to some point, and also my movement capabilities seemed limited. I could only move in circular directions contained in the spherical-like figure/scene I was in. However, the feeling of uncomfortableness lasted quite short. The reason is that I soon realized that this strange movement pattern was so because I was inside a new space inside the normal space. I have been compactified by the DMT entities. A technical note here. Compactification, as some people may know, is a common term in math and physics. In string theory, basically deals with the idea that the universe is not really 3D, or 3D plus time, but 10D, or 11D in some version of the theory. These extra dimensions are required for the fundamental strings of energy to originate only the correct particles we see in our world, electrons, quarks, etc., and not unphysical ones, tachyons. As the extra dimensions are not observed, they are assumed to be very small instead of extended, i.e., so small that we cannot move across them. The typical metaphor is to imagine a wire with a circular section. We may perceive it as a line, but a little ant can move along the circular internal direction of it. So the extra dimensions are compact. They are curled up, formed a compact manifold that it is usually a Calabu-Yau type. So when I say I was compactified, I am referring roughly to I had become the little ant. So let's return to the action. By that time, the vision became quite intense. Together with the compactification revelation, I was experiencing powerful feelings of euphoria and joy. The previous constraints on the movement disappeared, and the hyperdimensional character of the scene imposed itself. By that moment, I was able to move and displace freely in 6, 7 with time, spatial dimensions. Or I had a delusion/perception very similar to that. I was absolutely amazed and exalted, and just by the movement, the visions reached their peak. I was submerged in a complete happiness and stunningness because, as I said, I had been transported into a hyperdimensional 6D world Well, my mind was amazed in happiness and saturated, in a good way, in geometrical blooming and celebration. I could perceive like 6 dimensions at the same time. There were a 3D normal plus scene plus a 3D scene, the yellowish kind of geometric one, spherical with also some other figures, maybe some kind of cylinders arranged across different hyperplanes, everywhere. And both of them were overlapped and inserted in the same sight, scene, space, like in a 6-manifold/variety. And I perceived each of the 6 dimensions as an independent direction, which is indeed the definition of spatial dimension. At this point, there will be some people quite skeptical, so this requires some qualification. Like this report, there are lots of people here and there saying that they have been in a higher dimensional space during similar experiences. I don't claim I have really experienced such a thing. I am convinced that it is physically impossible. At the end, these are chemical alterations of the brain, and they cannot break the physical barriers of our worlds. My interpretation of what really happens here is that there are plenty of spatial, visual, and perceptual distortions/effects caused by DMT. When these distortions are mild, they are more or less easy to break down and describe. However, when they are wild or they combine in funky ways to create visions and perceptions of strange geometries and spaces, these spaces are not really impossible, e.g., they are not higher dimensional, but they are, sometimes, quite strange and offer a good parable, metaphor, or approximation to impossible spaces. So when I say I saw or perceived a 6D space, what I mean is that I had a hallucination so convincing or intricate that it was easier to depict it as a metaphor of higher dimensional space, rather than describing in detail a very long array or complicated effects. On the other side, I am not regarding any strange visual or rare perception to be higher dimensional stuff or impossible space. I try to be a bit more rigorous and careful with those terms. Now, it is quite useless trying to explain the entire thing, but I can, inaccurately, describe several components of it in order to give a glimpse. One partial analogy, and it is just a distorted approximation, like a parable or a projection to some inferior dimension, can be the following. Imagine that the exterior scene and the exterior dimensions, the room and further things, are symbolized by a rectangular clear prism, 3D, and the other dimensions, occupied mainly by the yellowish vision that emerged from the beginning, are symbolized by a curved yellow cylinder, like a quarter of a slim torus, counting the interior of it. So we have another 3D figure, and as a result, 3 plus 3 equals 60. The figures are arranged like in this figure. From now on, we will symbolize our focal point with a red ball. I will refer to the ball in the following, but just recall I didn't see a physical ball. It is just to mark my focal point. What happened is that my mind interpreted the prism and the torus to span 6 different independent dimensions in total. For example, the ball could move to the front in the cylinder and to the background in the prism at the same time. To understand this, we can use the following picture. Imagine that you see at time t0 the figure 0. Then you see at time t1 the figure 1, and at time 2 the figure 2. The geometrical perception is so accelerated, blooming, rich and exalted, and both images are perceived so fast, with such a short period of time, t2 minus t1, that the brain has problems to see which image is perceived before. It almost interprets that it is perceiving them at the same time. So, it interprets that both the ball of figure 1 and the ball of figure 2 are the same ball, moving at the same time both along the direction x5 in the prism and in the direction negative x3 in the cylinder. held by the autosuggestion of being in a hyperdimensional scene/site. The mind thinks that it is possible because they are independent directions. Together with this time disorganization, when you are perceiving directions which provokes a kind of superposition of images, there is another important effect. There is a strong perception that the space is strangely expanding, becoming ampler, so things seem to go further from you. Kind of hyperbolic, geometry-like, but retaining somehow the original form, so things seem to expand in a new direction. That is a rough metaphor of the geometry and visual aspect going on. However, the mental component was also quite strong, as expected. I had done a breakthrough as the reality, together with my role in it, had gone completely and substituted by another one. It was certainly a more progressive, not so abrupt breakthrough than the average of my breakthroughs. Maybe because my relaxed mental state before the trip. Anyhow, at some point, when I was already compactified and I was experiencing the hyperdimensional thing, I was in another reality. I was in the hyperspace, but in this time, unlike in the other trip, the most accentuated facet of hyperspace was clearly the hyperdimensionality, geometrical feeling, rather than the hyperreality, ontological, existential feeling, although both of them were present. At some point, the principal vision started to subside. As long as the main thing was ending, I started crying in happiness. There were also secondary visions. I do not remember the entire thing, neither all the visions and sensations I had. Which I certainly remember is that as I came down, I was extremely exultant. I felt like my neurons were saturated in joy and in geometrical richness. I was crying in happiness, and when I closed my eyes, beautiful 3D multicolored geometrical figures formed themselves. Lots of planes and other objects turned around and intersects among them in incredibly beautiful ways. They came to the center of the image, and spheres arose in their intersections in the center and expanded all along the image. These images lasted quite more than the usual when I am coming down. As I was coming back to reality, I thought that the DMT entities had explained to me and let me feel compactification and extra dimensions in a way that my limited brain could understand. I had perceived with all the senses, sight, touch, and all the others, and in a beautiful way 6 different dimensions, in an amazingly beautiful hyperdimensional scene. All the experience, it was so extremely beautiful, so amazing. I didn't know I could ever experience that amount of beauty. It was so pleasant and beautiful that after all, the first thing I did when I recovered my consciousness was crying with happiness and sob. So beautiful. Oh my God. I even screamed a crazy, strong shout. It's so beautiful. God. In fact, I recorded some of the reflections and descriptions. Also some of the sobs and screams, to capture a bit of the moment and help me to remember some things. Afterthoughts. At last I had my mythical, unimaginable, indescribable best experience ever that changes your life I had always read about in some DMT and other psychedelic reports. I didn't expect it to come in such a spectacular fashion, as I had done a good quantity of trips and psychedelic experiences before. This lucky event could be caused by different things, and of course, pure luck played a role. One main cause was good mood/mental state. I had achieved to get rid of some obsessions and loops/bad thoughts I was worried about some months ago, like the ones previous to the other trip I reported. Days after I was thinking about some interesting points. I am a person with a very pro-futuristic world attitude. in the sense that I believe in transhumanity, mind uploading, and other scientific marvels. And I think that in remote future, human beings will be able to live, perceive, and feel extraordinary, mathematical, scientific, aesthetical experiences. In this context, the experience of this report encouraged me, even more, to keep on exploring geometry, string/M theory, algebraic geometry, mathematics, etc., and to try to participate in that future. One reason is that maintaining this kind of experience as a constant state of the brain would be quite similar to some kind of paradise. Maybe it will have to be complemented with some elements or inputs that help to maintain a constant train of thoughts if necessary, because even though lots of rich connections appear in the psychedelic experience, they sometimes manifest a lack of linearity and focus in some aspects, which would be nice to be enhanced or corrected, to be functional in some way. Also, in a slightly more practical way, I will explore geometrically some of the visual/geometrical/perceptive effects and thoughts that appeared in the trip, and they could be useful in the future in the context of trying to build illusions or simulations of hyperdimensional perception. However, regarding this direction, it seems complicated to accurately replicate this kind of illusions without the component of autosuggestion of the brain that had been present in this trip. It would need lots of precision. Now, after all that, I almost don't know what to do. It is like you have been born, raised, thought, felt, worked, and now you have lived that, so it is okay. You can already die. In fact, some days later I took a plane, and when it was taking off, I thought for a moment that if the plane accidentally crashes, I wouldn't be very worried. I can pass away quite realized and satisfied. On the other side, I had let go quite a long period of time, and still some time left, in order to assimilate it, enjoy, and celebrate what I have lived. Let it rest, integrate, write a bit about it, etc. Once I have done a partial analysis, I almost surely will keep on doing psychedelics. But this one was indeed a profound before and after.